There we go. Okay. So, love technology when it works. We're going to talk about a couple different methods of how you can track things you do and track projects and organize them. Um, we're going to briefly talk about a couple of concepts that go along with that, and then I'll just wrap it up at the end. Hopefully, this won't take too long. And it's like the musician's self-doubt. Do I have a good read? Do I really sound good? All right. So when you think about how to run some kind of endeavor, the first simple way I call the feral method, which is you basically decide, I want to do something. I want to achieve some kind of thing. And then you organize everything in your head. Maybe you make some kind of random notes. And you just go out and do stuff. I mean, this is how we sort of intuitively learn how to run things or manage things that we want to get done, sort of in an intuitive way. And for me, that's kind of what my notes usually end up looking like. Sort of random looking various things that get organized. If you can figure out what I was writing notes about afterwards, I'll give you $1, but don't shout it out. Anyway, so that's a very simple way where we just sort of make a bunch of random notes, we do things, and that was just the first one I could find. I couldn't find anything music related. Now, another way that we sort of learn how to do things is by putting together to-do lists. When I first moved to New York City after I graduated from music school, I started making lists of things that I wanted to do, and I always titled them items to attend to, which is where I've sort of affectionately kept on this abbreviation of ITAT, going back to '79 when I moved to New York City. But really, most people call these to-do lists. And what I would do is basically do a brain dump of all the things that I want to do, and maybe a little bit of hierarchical organization. And then I have to see how far I can go. Then I would check them off. So, losing my microphone here. So you can see on the very bottom, it says, I don't know if you can read it, it says practice. I'm not sure that one will ever get crossed off. You can see above there too is the word exercise. So, and what used to happen is I used to feel guilty that things that I wrote down were not getting done. And then one day I sort of had this revelation that I'm not getting them done because I really don't want to do them. So that was a reality. And then I kind of excused myself and said, okay, cross these off arbitrarily. You're never going to do them, and move on. So again, it's deciding what do you want to do, coming up with some way of tracking it, and figuring out completion. So I make a list and I cross it off. And what's funny is all these things that I'm going to talk to you about are things I use now still. So they're still contemporary. Here's another more complex way of doing it, which is called the task list system. And it's a fundamental concept to all project management, which is basically you take that list, and it tends to be very specific to a project or endeavor that you're working on, and you lay it out hierarchically. You do it in an outline. And generally, you do it chronologically. I'm going to start with these things, and maybe there's a bunch of sub-tasks that go along with each item that I'm doing, and I'm going to do it from start to finish. And what it does is it results in a blocked screen, excuse me, because it results in a logical set of steps, and it's really used as the basis for what can be very extremely complex methods of doing project tracking and tracking things that we do. And you probably would not be surprised to learn that there are huge systems and software and methodologies for how people do projects. So here's an example. Here's an example of a hierarchical list that I found somewhere on the internet. This is where, obviously this is some sort of a Broadway show thing or show type of thing, where it's listed chronologically into different things, and they're broken down hierarchically into things that are in subcategories. This is really easy to use. If you know how to use Microsoft Office, if you know how to use Word, you can just use the number outlining tool, and use that for creating your different levels of hierarchy so that you can kind of organize things. And what's nice about this, it gives you sort of a visual way of seeing the different relationships between the different things that you want to do. And it's sequential, yes. So here, for example, is the first page of a task analysis I did for our last Become conference. This is the first page of it. And the reason why I did this was I was working with a conference coordinator in North Carolina, and I was in Austin and she was in Asheville, and we were coordinating on all the things we wanted to get done. So what I did was I created this huge hierarchical list. This goes on for about 5 or 6 pages, and we agreed that we were going to decide who owned these different things. So you can take this kind of simple sort of organization and assign ownership from one person to another and make it very visible about who owns these things. And in this case, what we also did was I had a column on the far right side that was target or completion dates. So you can decide when do you think this will be done and when have they gotten completed. So that was another way of doing the cross the thing off method. And that worked extremely well. So we had accountability, we had a pretty good idea of what we needed to get done, and it worked like a champ. Now, there are more formal methodologies out there in the marketplace, and I really don't want to go into this in too much depth because I know I'll lose you all, because they get very arcane and very complex. However, they are still built on this concept of hierarchical lists of things, but they just add more dimensions of things that you track and show the relationships between them. So very common if you're going to be doing some kind of a large project, and it could be something like put together an opera, right? The first, what we call phase 0, is where you basically do all your organization and decide what are the things we want to achieve. Can we describe what those are? Do we get buy-in to fund something like this? And that becomes the first phase, the 0 phase. Then the next one is the entire organization of that project of creating an opera. And they're going to include things like, order lumber, build sets, hire musicians, assign dates to when you're going to be doing these things. And obviously the conclusion, or I'm not going to say obviously, but a conclusion of phase 1 would be a performance. Then you may have other phases. I say 2 through N because there may be multiple iterations of things going on after that. Maybe you're going to do a second opera, or maybe you may go back and make changes to what you're doing after that. And in the business world, the people that run these kind of things are called project managers, very simple, PMs. And even in some big companies, they have so much of this management going on, they have entire offices that are called PMOs that are solely devoted towards seeing that complex projects get done on time and on budget, which are all things that in many ways we deal with either individually or in our institutions or in our organizations. So in that phase 0, one of the most difficult things to do is to do estimating. How long is this going to take? How much time do you need and how much money is it going to take in order to put an opera together? Now, I just grabbed this one. This is from a technology, actually it's out of a book I wrote. But one of the first things you do is you need to get all your stakeholders together, all the people who are involved in this, and get them into one room and figure out what are our goals, what are the things we need to do, and how are we going to go about doing that. That's called a joint application development session, or they call those JAD sessions. It's a very common term. And so you set your goals. One of the common ways of addressing that is when people have goals, they are usually virtually limitless. I want everything. And it's actually not a bad exercise to get together and say, okay, well, you want to do this thing. Tell me everything conceivably that you might want to do. So that's really good as an exercise for figuring out the scope of all the things that you may want to do in some endeavor. Then what you do is you go back through it again and say, okay, well, what can we realistically achieve, given what we know our constraints are in terms of money and resources and time, okay? And this is kind of an interesting method. So if you can come up with that hierarchy, what you can also do is go out laterally with the different kinds of skill sets of people that you may need in order to achieve something. So you may need help in set construction. You may need help in, orchestra management, whatever. You can break that into the different things, and you can ask each people, okay, well, based on what you know about what we're talking about, give me a rough idea of how many days it's going to take you. And so what you're doing is you're then methodically breaking these things down into small pieces. So it's always easier to estimate small than large, right? Instead of taking the 50,000-foot view, you want to get down to the 500-foot view. And it really depends on how detailed you make that hierarchical outline of all the things you do. But by breaking it down, it's much easier to say, how long will it take me to acquire lumber than to say, how long will it take me to build sets? So you break it down, you estimate it, then all you do is you add it up. And that should give you a fairly good, accurate, and defensible argument about why you're doing what you're doing, what it costs, and how long it's going to take. So for example, I went through an interesting period where I worked at Lehman Brothers, who's been in the news recently. I worked there from 93 until 99. And I reported to the director of marketing, who would have us do these big projects. And by coming up with a project plan that was very detailed, inevitably I would go into this person and they would say, why is it costing so much money? Why is it taking so long? And you pull out this long sheet and say, okay, you want it shorter? What would you like us to eliminate? And they go, oh, no, that's okay. So you can then justify what it is you're doing. Now, as you probably are not surprised, Microsoft actually has a very well-known tool, which is probably the biggest used one in the marketplace, which is part of the Office suite called Microsoft Project. And not unsurprisingly, it does and helps you do all these things. I'm sorry we don't have this where you can read this in more detail, but this is actually a view of a Microsoft Project screen. It looks a lot like Excel, actually, where you have a hierarchical outline. And what that allows you to do is you can do that task analysis. You can put it in there. You can key it in. You can also put in all those durations that you came up with when you did your JAD session in your estimating group by breaking all these things down. You can also do the thing like I did on the Brevard list, where you assign resources as to who's going to do things. But then it also does one other very cool thing, which is very difficult not to do in software, which is every set of tasks has dependencies from one to the next. And they call that successors and predecessors. So if I want to build a set, I have to buy lumber. So there is a dependency between one and the other, which means that the longer it takes for me to buy lumber, the longer it's going to take me to get my set done. And that's going to seem patently obvious. I mean, none of this is really rocket science. All it's doing is taking all of your organizational things that you have learned about how you want to run some project, and it puts it into sort of a living organism that allows you to track what has gotten done, how long it's going to take, what are the dependencies between the different steps, and where is something like the critical path. You've probably heard that term, but specifically what it means is you will reach a point in a project where it's totally dependent on one step. And for every day that takes longer to do, the entire thing gets pushed down a day, such as obtain an orchestra. We're going back to this opera paradigm. If you don't have an orchestra and you need to start rehearsals, your rehearsals cannot start until that orchestra thing gets resolved. So getting an orchestra is on the critical path to your entire project. What this also does, if you're interested and want to use it, you can take your resources and figure out how much per hour do they cost. And it'll also calculate what your entire project costs are, even including personnel, which is an interesting thing to do. So if you know you've got to hire people and they have a certain rate, like a stage director or an orchestra conductor or musicians, you can actually put that rate in there and it will aggregate what those costs are, and you can use that for estimating your projects. So all these are things that allow you to methodically take all the things you need to do in order to run a project, put them into one one view that allows you to track it all and be accountable, and to be able to do things like estimating and to present that to your stakeholders so that everybody knows what's expected of them. So where's Michael? Oh, there he is. So he always teases me about this. These are the universally accepted 3 factors of a project. The scope of the project, the resources, and the time. And they all have relations to each other. So the bigger the project you have, the more resources and the more time it has. If you want to have your project take less time, well, you can either try to apply more resources or you can reduce the scope of what it is you're trying to do. And the whole joke about this is oftentimes you're in a project where there's a crunch and people are worried that things aren't getting done soon enough. And they say, well, can't we just apply more resources? And the old joke about that is that, well, sometimes you can do that and most of the time you can't. And they say, it's like you can't put 9 women in a room for a month and have a baby. So some things just take their time for getting done. And that's kind of the way it goes. So there's different relationships between these that you have to keep an eye on. Here's another view of Microsoft Project. I'm not actually selling that. But it is a basic software product that you can go out and buy. It costs probably a couple $100. On the right side there, you can't see too well, is what's called a Gantt chart. That's a visual representation of the timeline of each one of the items that you do. If you see little stars there, that's little milestones, like orchestra hired, sets built, so you know that you've achieved certain milestones. Those big black lines are the higher level aggregation of your hierarchy, where you may have sub tasks along with that. And the red usually means that you're running behind schedule. And it also shows the different, I don't know if you can see, there's some vertical lines. Those shows dependencies. So it's just sort of an interesting, in theory, intuitive way of looking at your project and seeing which way it's going. How am I doing time-wise? Okay, ripping right along here. Okay, what we've been discussing, this whole hierarchical method where you start chronologically and work down from the upper left to the lower right of tasks getting done, that's traditionally called a waterfall approach because they all trickle down as you get all your stuff done. There are other methodologies out there, just to make you aware of that. Fixed price, Agile, Cost Plus, they are all used in different places. Agile is used in software development. Cost Plus is used in defense industries. Fixed price is where you're going to do something and you're going to get paid a flat rate for doing the entire thing, which can be risky. If you know how to estimate really well and you know how to get things done, you're going to be able to deliver on time, on budget. If you don't, then you will miss your deadlines and possibly can lose money because you're only going to get paid a certain amount of money for doing something. So anything else here? There's lots of resources, tons of resources for project management out there. First of all, there's even a society, there's like the equivalent of the College Music Society for project managers called the Project Management Institute. They even do certification where people can put on their business card, comma, PMP. You can imagine what I call them when they have PMPs. It's actually not bad. It's based on a methodology. And if you want to be really good at running projects, you can't just know one, you need to know 20 different ways of getting things done. And anybody who runs stuff intuitively knows that anyway. There are tons of websites out there of things related to project management. There are lots of books. You can go do seminars, training. You can do training in Microsoft Project to learn how to use it. So there's a ton of resources out there that allow you to learn how to be more effective at running your endeavors and being trained in it. So to make this in summary, the big first thing is always start by defining your goals. What do you want to do? If you cannot really clearly say what that is, you need to go back to the drawing board until you figure out what that is. Because if you can't say what it is, then other people aren't going to understand that. Outline the work that needs to be done. That's really easy to use. You don't need to buy project. Most of us have Word, or if you buy a computer these days and don't want to spring the $150 for the student home edition, you can use Microsoft Works, which comes with Vista now, and it allows you to do the same thing. Break things down to the smallest level that you can, because it's easier to manage rather than trying to build a bridge. You can't say, I want to build a bridge. You have to say, well, I need to do all these various subtasks in order to build a bridge. And then you can estimate them. You can track your project, and don't be afraid to adjust whatever you need to do as you run into more information or you run into challenges, because that's a normal part of running a project, as it is to put in some extra buffer in there, extra time, in case things run over, you have some way of adjusting to that. Just like we had that break after their session. And then the bottom line is, use whatever level of organization you deem appropriate. Like I showed you, I still use the Farrell method. You know, I make crazy lists of notes that nobody can decipher except for me, and not even me when I go back a few weeks later. Or you can make to-do lists, you can make outlines. You need to decide what level of tracking you need to do, or just do it in your head. The problem that I have is I can never remember all the ideas I have. That's why I have one of those digital recorders when I'm in my car, so I can dictate notes to myself at the end of the day. So, does anybody have any questions? I know that was sort of a high-speed injection of project management. Does that all make sense to you?
How about managing multiple projects at the same time?
You can do multiple instances of what we talked about and just keep them separate and track them separately. You know, the biggest challenge is getting used to the idea of what we talk about the term multitasking now, but it's really more deciding what has priority in the things that you're doing and giving them more attention. So I have projects that are very short term. I have projects that I've had going on for years or decades, like in the book projects I do, have been going on for a very long time, and they periodically bubble up and get attention from me. The biggest challenge people have is getting used to that concept of keeping a lot of balls in the air at one time. And that seems like a big challenge. And it's really just, again, watching your priorities, tracking what you do, and feeling comfortable with the idea that you can do more than one thing at one time. We are not singly focused. Yes?
Does that mean that Microsoft Project doesn't actually, it shows you a page with one project on it, and you can't sort of integrate multiple projects?
You actually can. And you could actually put links between separate Microsoft Project plans if you want to. Or you can put them all into one big, massive, project document, by having them at the same hierarchical level as each other. So you may have top-level projects that are all in the same plan, but you don't have to do that. You can break it into separate files if you want to. So it's got all sorts of craziness if you want, like most Microsoft products. Yes?
Do you have any advice on when you're writing grants and you're talking about the project that you're planning to do with the money? Do you have any advice on how to be clearer about how much money you need and why you need certain things?
Yeah, that's a really good one, because in my experience in writing grants, the more that you can show intelligence and forethought in how you want to spend money, the more likely they are going to be to entrust you with that money. So the first part of that, and it's no different than if I was writing any kind of a project plan or project document or proposal, which is you need to have a way of textually describing what you're doing. Then you also need to break down what the money you're using, what it's being used for, and how it's going to be spent, and at what rate, so that they can look at that and feel trusted that you're not going to waste their money, which is usually their big concern. The other way of being successful is to know somebody at the grant agency, and which usually worked for me. Any more questions? All right, so we're done. Good, we got through that one. Thank you.